I made a video recently talking about the state of disrepair the Victorian public housing system is in and has been in for decades. In it, I talk about how the iconic Melbourne housing flats in the city have been underfunded and neglected honestly since their inception through respective governments regardless of party. I spoke to efforts to try and reform and change how we do housing in the state, where since the early 2000s, the state government has resolved to outsource a majority of its public housing services to non-governmental and private providers. It does this in the pursuit of this social mix urban planning model, where basically you integrate public housing residents who are more likely to be disadvantaged with higher income renters. As detailed thoroughly in the video, this approach doesn't work, primarily because the profit motive, i.e. how investors and developers make as much cash as they can, is what drives said investors and developers. This means that public good isn't prioritized, but rather how much money can be made. This leads to negative outcomes like segregation, decreases in public housing rooms, and the delegation of responsibility of repairs, maintenance, and upgrades to private providers as opposed to the government. Now, at the end of that video, I gave some admittedly very broad solutions and policy prescriptions, which to me at least kind of stick out from the more detailed and interrogative video. So while I do agree with the general framework of policy I gave in that video, this video is going to be delving into specifics, what we actually need to do to fix public housing in this city and this state, how we can use it to build counterpower. Social mix attempts to solve the problem of ghettoization. Basically, the problem with urban renewal schemes in the 20th century was that while they house a lot of people, they just kind of put a bunch of poor people in big towers and left it at that. Obviously, this has created regional segregation based on class, where you have poor people living in poorer areas with less and lower quality amenities and services, more than likely raising poorer families, etc. So then, more than likely, good-intentioned academics and planners said, what if we put a bunch of wealthier people into these disadvantaged areas? They behave well, and not only do they attract more investment into these areas to improve limited amenities and services, but they become role models for the poor people to emulate. Bit silly. Of course, it should be noted that the people suggesting these proposals wanted wealthier residents to move into places of disadvantage, rather than disadvantaged people moving into wealthier areas.
The facade of equality and social justice for neighbourhoods provides a narrative cover for pathologizing spatial deprivation, embedded by the social mix ideal and its promotion in a range of contexts. Crucially, mixing does not represent a solution in and of itself. Its implementation is superficial, as demonstrated above, with little attention to the wider structural processes that lead to the concentration of urban disadvantage. While unconsciously pricing out underprivileged groups, affluent newcomers reclaim their right to the neighbourhood and the inner city from those who had supposedly stolen it.
The public housing renewal agenda in Victoria should be understood as a reorganisation of the geography of advantage and disadvantage across Melbourne, deepening a wholesale class restructuring of the inner city. As argued by many in the literature, the research therefore concludes that the private profit motive is the primary driving policy directive of social mix as advanced in the public housing renewal program in Victoria. To find alternatives to social mix, we need to get to the core of why social mix is wrong, the profit motive, and so we need to center the needs of people and not profit. This is called decommodification. A commodity is a good or service you produce for a return or a profit. Money in, commodity produced, more money in. So decommodification is simply saying, we're not doing it for the money. Right now in our housing system, which includes that social mix model, everything's kind of done to increase real estate values, increase house price growth, So if we're not doing it for the money, we're doing it for the people. And so it needs to be the people that inform, spearhead, and dictate the necessary initiatives. What we first need is a body or a group that's representative of all those who have interest in this initiative. Let's call that a federation. Inside that federation, we have the respective interest groups that represent the different people involved. So that would include, but of course isn't limited to, a tenants association, an organization where tenants of a particular area come together to form a group or associate. Within that association, you can have different groups or caucuses that have particular needs. So for example, a veterans division, a disability division, etc. Next, we need the people who will build the housing. In Australia, there's something called the Big Industry Group of Unions, which are basically a group of construction and construction adjacent unions, which include the CFMEU, the ETU, the AMWU, and the PPTEU. Unionised workplaces are more democratic, they're informed by the members on the site, and there's a history of Australian construction unions being deeply involved with developments alongside, not separate from, local communities. Thirdly, we need funding. This can either be in the form of a bank created by the government or a banking cooperative, what's called a credit union. Fourthly, we need a civil servants organisation or union, as we need people to operate some of the particulars and behind the scenes, spanning from accountants to urban planners. If this sounds far-fetched to you in Australia right now, it kind of is. However, most of the barriers are political barriers, not necessarily practical ones. What I just described is what happened in this Finnish town called Tapiola. All kinds of community representative groups got together and planned and constructed housing according to the needs of the people in the community. As noted here, public utility organizations were successful alternatives to private construction companies in creating new housing areas and suburbs. Instead of making a profit, they were able to use resources for the suburban environment and to the benefit of the members' search for a higher standard of living in their homes. Tapiola, for example, was founded by the Housing Foundation, which included the Confederation of Finnish Trade Unions, the Central Organisation of Tenants, the Mannerheim Child Welfare Federation, the Finnish Federation of Civilian and Military Invalids, and the Civil Servants Federation. The problem with this model, however, is that while it decommercializes some aspects of the housing market, it's still a market. Tapiola was a homeowners society, reaching 80% home ownership as the Housing Foundation sold the properties it built collectively onto the market to future individual homeowners and landlords. I couldn't find much in English about Tapiola today compared to the 1950s and 60s, outside of some Reddit threads saying it's nice but also expensive, and generally Espoo, the city it's in, is more expensive than the rest of Finland. And there has been a trend in Finnish cities of planning and distribution being more geared towards profit at the expense of low-income people. But we have a more documented example in Sweden, where its housing cooperative sector has been a crucial element of government housing programs. Likewise in Sweden, trade unions and other groups got together to build and distribute housing for the community as opposed to primarily being motivated by profit. This is something I want to get back to later, but instead of outright selling a lot of its public housing, Swedish governments allowed residents to form housing cooperatives, which has actually increased the proportion of cooperative housing in the economy. But the deregulation and the financialization of markets in Sweden has meant that these cooperative housing properties are significantly inflated in value. Like Australia, lowering credit standards and deregulating the banking sector temporarily made it easier for residents to acquire properties. And in Sweden, there were specific provisions and incentives for public housing tenants to transition their estates into housing cooperatives. However, debt-to-income ratios have risen dramatically, with more than 50% of households having a debt-to-income ratio north of 300% by 2020. Sure, a lot of these are housing cooperative residents, but the way in which the cooperative sector has blossomed in Sweden has been through excessive credit flowing through the economy, promoting investment and speculation, which as a result, housing prices rose. In fact, before public housing to cooperative transitions were legalized, we could see the consequences of deregulation and financialization in the cooperative sector. Between 1974 and 1980, the average price paid for an HSB dwelling increased by 337%, and between 1980 and 1988 by 338%, while real prices in general in the same periods increased by 142% and 156% respectively. This development was further supported by the banks, which from the mid-1980s, as a part of the general financial deregulation, started to accept tenant ownership as collateral for loans. These companies have upgraded multi-family homes and thus increased rents, which resulted in larger profits and a decrease in the affordable housing stock. In this new reality, venture capital actors have taken advantage of contextual conditions and applied powerful, calculative devices. Think of it like this: instead of you outright owning your house by yourself, a house as an asset with a value which you can sell on the market, in the Swedish cooperative sector, you'd own a stake or a part in the housing cooperative which owns your house, a house as an asset with a value they can sell on the market. It's still commodified, it's still built and distributed via the profit motive. And so we come back to the same problem we have with the social mix model. While there are obviously many structural problems with the Nordic cooperative sectors, I think that there are big lessons we can learn from them. Organizations that represent the community coming together and working towards a common goal is something really good, and I think something we need to recreate. One of Australia's most famous trade unionists, Jack Mundy, said in the 70s,
"Unless the unions broaden their horizons and tackle all issues concerning their members, from wages and living costs to the type of education needed today, from medical care to housing, from democratic rights to peace, they will invite further criticism from members, young workers, students and others."
There's a reason why the Australian housing market is so strong. It's very decentralised. If a single company in the economy fails, sure, the employees will be laid off, there'll be less produced in the economy, but the consequences aren't fatal. If the housing market fails, every homeowner with a mortgage is in direct jeopardy, and with them, the big banks who lent them the money. So it's very hard to change things in the market, as too much of a downturn can become catastrophic. This is because the majority of asset holders, the majority of the wealth, is held individually by homeowners. Everyone's interlinked in this house of cards. If we want to build a substantial, long-lasting decommodified system, it likewise has to be something decentralized, run by and for people, which is part of the reason why the government can't just go and build a ton of public housing and call it a day. Now, modern-day unions like the CFMU have begun to show interest in broader questions. Unfortunately, despite being mentored under the likes of the more politically and socially aware unionists like John Cummins, like Jack Mundy, the CFMU in the past decade under people like John Secker has fallen into simply just trying to get good wages and conditions for its members. And as we've seen, purely making that your end goal can lead to corruption and criminality. That and being mates with fascists. But under the newer leadership with the National Secretary Zack Smith, however, the union has talked about bigger picture things like housing, and like his predecessors, Zack Smith doesn't shy away from a political label. While the shift in rhetoric is great, nothing's really been done about it outside of a few press releases. I mean, unions like the CFMU and the AWU have a lot of leverage. They typically cover civil construction, which means their members are the ones working on big government-funded infrastructure projects. But from serious corruption and criminal elements tied to CFMU leadership to the AWU unscrupulously collaborating with developers and bosses at the expense of their members, it seems that these two aren't taking their leverage seriously. So, for housing decommodification to work, we need community organizations like unions to be informed primarily by the concerns of the community and be concerned with bigger picture concepts like housing. In fact, the building union that people like Jack Mundy led only became like that once organizers and workers united democratically to get rid of the previous corrupt leadership. So, it's happened before. But okay, even if we got all that, clearly it very easily can devolve, as we saw in the Nordic examples. Homes have become subsumed under the logic of asset-based welfare, and consequently, their exchange value increasingly determines people's economic security and well-being. Now, there have been experiments done in various cities where you try to mitigate the recommodification of housing. I'm going to give you a few.
Jo crec que segurament, evidentment, posem en dubte qüestions culturals molt establertes, no? La propietat privada, la individualitat, la privacitat.
In Barcelona, what's called the grants of use model has been implemented to a degree, where the state or local government will lease out public land to a cooperative which owns the house. Residents who are members of the cooperative, which is leasing out the land owned by the government, aren't allowed to individually sell or rent out their home. However, they have what's called indefinite user rights, which means, in all but name, it's their home. They can have pets, they can renovate, etc. It's their house. It has a use value, but no exchange value. It can't be speculated on. And as we can see, costs are lower and satisfaction is higher in grants of use housing compared to private market housing. Under the grant of use model, residents aren't necessarily renters, technically speaking. They're stakeholders in a zero equity cooperative to which they pay maintenance costs to. But of course, they then get decision-making power in, let's say, a congress or assembly where all the residents come together to deliberate. So they get all the benefits of rent being a low upfront cost in terms of accommodation, and all the benefits of home ownership, that being autonomy and directorship. It's infinitely preferable for governments to build and promote this type of housing compared to the traditional public housing flats we see today in Melbourne. As I point out in the first video, public housing under respective governments has been severely neglected and now is being privatized. Cooperatives which own housing on otherwise government land are better for a few reasons, the main one being resident participation. Resident participation in decision making means that not only is the wishes of the residents represented in their housing, but it fosters a certain kind of community. Of course, though, there are issues with this model. In contrast to other types of commons, housing commons emerging from highly regulated urban spaces require some degree of professionalization, externalization, and state support. Examples include public land, subsidies, or public lines of credit. Without public support and a certain degree of professionalization, housing cooperatives are just an alternative for a happy few. Overly relying on the state has its obvious problems, as the state isn't beholden to the needs and wants of members of the housing cooperative. Political parties, lobbyists, they come and go. Another problem is that, as pointed out in the research, the barrier of entry can be quite high, from upfront fees to expertise needed to build homes without institutional support. As part of building counterpower needed to create a better society is of course to expand it into every sector of society, which, if you remember in the Nordic examples from before, is where the bigger organizations may come into play. Another problem with these cooperatives is that the work needed to maintain housing can be exhausting and overbearing for largely unqualified residents, so some degree of externalization and professionalization, where a group of designated professionals take care of certain needs, is arguably necessary for a long-term project, and more often than not, in these examples, these kinds of resources directly or indirectly come from the state. Now, it is undeniable that having the state on our side here would make things easier, but the state isn't necessarily interested in the same delegatory power as what we're talking about here, particularly the current state. In my view, building counterpower includes building institutions and systems that would otherwise be fulfilled by a central government. However, you don't need to share this belief to still support collectivizing housing. I just think for it to have longevity, it needs to be separate from the state, which kind of leads into my next example, Uruguay. The demand for housing cooperatives in Uruguay in the late 1960s was driven by a strongly politicized and unionized working class that soon succeeded in influencing national housing policies. Through the 60s, the cooperative movement created two different types of cooperative housing: previous savings cooperatives and mutual aid cooperatives. Previous savings cooperatives were geared towards workers with higher incomes who could afford the upfront costs, and mutual aid cooperatives were geared towards those with lower incomes who would work in return for equity in the cooperative, work which a lot of the time was building their own home. The latter model was very effective at promoting a more solidaristic local economy, and it significantly lowered labour costs involved in housing construction and community maintenance, as this labour was done for the stake in the cooperative. This mobilization from below pressured the then liberal Uruguayan government to legislate a specific land bank dedicated to lending out subsidized low-cost loans to cooperatives. Professional support also came from the state in the form of what was called the IAT, which essentially was a task force assigned to every cooperative to help with everything from planning to management. Like in Barcelona, the Housing Act in Uruguay made it difficult for cooperative housing to be recommodified, but nonetheless, it faced significant challenges, one of the most pertinent being a military coup in 1973. The military government basically dismantled all institutional support and legislation permitting the existence of housing cooperatives, crippling the sector in its embryonic state. Today, while cooperatives have made a comeback in Uruguay, and about 30,000 households live in cooperatives in Uruguay at this point, they only comprise around 3% of the total market. While the Uruguayan example is extreme in how reliance on the state can be our downfall, you may have picked up that commonly the downfall of cooperative housing sectors comes from changes in the state. As we've talked about with Sweden before, the financialization of cooperative housing came after neoliberalism came about, after the Swedish government deregulated and liberalized the economy, after specifically legalizing the conversion of government-owned housing to private cooperatives. And even now in democratic Uruguay, we can see the growth in cooperatives seems very much dependent on which political party is in power, kind of neutering the whole point of longevity and counterpower to begin with. Counterpower is about building institutions and structures within the current society, but increasingly detached and independent of said society. Government support, that being an institution in the current society, being so integral to the growth of housing counterpower, defeats the whole point. So then, how do we contend with the point made by many in the literature that these structures must harness redistributive capacities of the state whilst simultaneously defending their autonomy from both the state and the market? Primarily based in Germany, the syndicate model came from the housing organization MHS, or these words I can't pronounce. Unlike the previous examples we've spoken about, the MHS mostly doesn't rely on government land or government funding, instead characterized by a solidarity financing mechanism and a complete legal structure that prevents recommodification of projects. For one, MHS is organized as what's called a limited liability corporation or an LLC. This means the syndicate is broken up into two entities, a voluntary association and a limited liability company. All of the households are members of the association, of which delegates are sent to the General Assembly that occurs 3 to 4 times a year. These General Assemblies discuss and decide upon the direction of the syndicate and draw up instructions for management, as they are the sole shareholders of the syndicate. Like the Barcelona grant of use model, residents retain user control over their homes, and the property is owned by the cooperative. Of course, residents are the sole shareholders of the cooperative, as I just said. This means that they can make decisions together about the direction of the cooperative. It'd be highly unlikely, for example, that residents would decide to restrict their own autonomy, but it would also mean that if individuals want to break away and sell off their home, they have to somehow convince the rest of the cooperative. That makes it very, very difficult to re-privatize or sell off syndicate assets for a profit, which is a key weakness other housing cooperatives suffer from. Of course, people can and do often leave or move out of the syndicate, but the assets remain in the control of the LLC, which is key to ensuring that the assets or the capital is neutralized or unable to be speculated on in the housing market. Now, the MHS has expanded outside of simply being a housing provider. As put by someone who visited one of the complexes governed by the syndicate, in addition to the apartments, there are now 2 busy kindergartens, a radio station, a small printing house, a food cooperative, and a cafe. Smaller operations are fit in with a photo studio, a ceramics workshop, and an antique shop. There are local offices of aid organizations such as Rosa Hilf, which supports the LGBT+ community, and the Feminist Women's Center. Refugees and immigrants, without being asked for papers or insurance, receive medical and legal advice. They can also participate in German language or computer science courses. As discussed in the interview from the same article, the MHS has also branched out to the agricultural sector. In terms of financing, MHS has a diverse set of revenue streams. Only 7% of required funds for MHS's real estate was funded through individual households. 39% of funds came from direct loans from things like private crowdfunding to local government loans. So for example, the 4-houser project in this place, the lender was the city council. Again, this is where trade unions, for example, could really come in handy. So, compared to other models, MHS is not as reliant on government resources. MHS has also sought to export the model across Europe, like in Austria, France, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic. This work is commendable, as isolated these movements kind of fail. Which leads me to the problems with the current syndicate model, but one that's completely rectifiable. There's very little observable involvement from different community organizations and sectors in the economy. While there's been attempts on a local level and even attempts to branch out to agriculture as previously mentioned, there's been a very lacking organized labor presence, for example. Now, I don't blame the MHS leadership or the membership for this. It's not as if they've done something wrong per se. It's more that this is something they have to reckon with if they're interested in longevity and they want this scaled upwards. Though it should be said that they've made considerable progress. As of 2023, MHS houses about 4,500 people, amounting to 280 million euros, which will never be realized on the market again. We've gone and looked at these big international models of housing decommodification in hopes to show that maybe a sustainable model could work in Australia. Now, comparatively, we don't have this kind of motion. However, there are groups and people agitating towards a future where housing is decommodified, or at the very least, the most vulnerable in society who desperately need housing should be able to get it.
The problem with any effort to decommodify housing is that we can't rely on the goodwill of governments to do it for us. It's simply not in their interests, and that's not just because, they're politicians on inflated salaries that as a result they invest in housing and they want their personal investments to increase in value. It's because the Victorian government gets a significant amount of their revenue from stamp duty. It's about $9 billion, and it grows if the value of house prices grow. Throughout history, overseas and in Australia, the only time that we've made progress in decommodifying housing is if there's been a strong social movement for the decommodification of housing. Generally, when people want the government to do something that is against its own interest, like it is here, it will affect its revenue if the decommodification of housing occurs. It takes more than simply pressure for the government to respond. The government responds to threats. And we have a lot of examples of that in this country, and my favourite example is the green bans movement that occurred in the 70s and 80s. The green bans arose out of the community being incredibly dissatisfied with what the government was doing, including things like demolishing public housing. And it resulted in the community organising and getting together and threatening the government and its revenue. That was incredibly effective. It saved a lot of public housing and it saved a lot of green spaces. Today the same thing applies. It's going to take more than a petition for the government to act on the decommodification of housing. And there are a number of community organisations opposing the government's commodification of housing and its further commodification of housing. These are organisations like the Save Public Housing Collective, who resisted the eviction at Barrack Beacon. There are organisations like the Renters and Housing Union, which organise around tenants' rights, resisting eviction, public housing, a bunch of other stuff. And there are organisations like Victorian Socialists, who organise and resist at many of the same things. It would also be remiss of me to ignore the Greens' own threats to the government by organising around public housing tenants. The Greens' threat is to the government's electoral power, and that is certainly a good angle to add pressure. But this is also the area that the government is most experienced in when it comes to fighting that battle. And if they are successful in their battle in terms of getting the balance of power in Parliament, it relies on us again, once more, relying on the goodwill of the government to do what we want for us. So my message to you is, if you want to see the decommodification of housing, threaten the government. Get involved in threatening the government. Get organised. Join one of these community organising groups when you see it happen, whether that's the Greens, whether that's the Renters and Housing Union, whether that's Save Public Housing Collective, whether that's Victorian Socialists or any of the other many groups that exist in this field. There's a lot of stuff to do and there's a lot of stuff going on already. So yeah, I encourage you to join one of these groups, but particularly if you are a renter, join the Renters and Housing Union, and if you are working, join your trade union. If you join your trade union, get involved in pressuring your trade union to act when it comes to the decommodification of housing. There's some pretty big stuff coming up when it comes to public housing, and I don't want to mention too much of it in this video, and in fact any of it at all. But I do encourage you to stay tuned and get involved.
A key problem with public housing in Melbourne is the lack of concern and centrality of tenants. A cooperative movement, one led by and for tenants, would likely solve the problems of derelict housing and infrastructure and the existing housing shortage. Now, despite my reservations about government reliance, here we have an abundance of policies which state governments can borrow from, none of which are particularly controversial or require setting off the property industry and creating electoral uncertainty. The grants of use model for zero equity housing in Barcelona arguably is the best and most applicable for the Victorian government right now. Like, let's say they terminate all the potential contracts they've got with social and private housing providers on public land. That's a ton of public land they can build housing on, and then lease out to a housing cooperative they could create, like in the Swedish example where public to cooperative transitions were legalized, or like the Uruguayan example where they established a public land bank and dedicated task forces designed to help residents set up and finance a cooperative. The Uruguayan example particularly demonstrates how scalable this is, as 30,000 households live in cooperatives. We only have 10,000 tenants who live in the public housing towers in Melbourne. Of course, big building unions like the CFMEU and the AWU have a chance to show that they're not just concerned with the immediate concerns of their members, but that they care enough about their communities to help construct a new public housing sector. As I mentioned in the first video, the government legally can seize private land, as it has for infrastructure projects, and I argue that this land and the 100,000 or so empty homes in Melbourne should be used to house the 60,000 households on the public housing waiting list. Of course, while all of this can be legislated tomorrow, it's important to understand why governments won't do this. Governments today are primarily motivated by the profitability and commodity production of the private sector, which of course extends to housing. Property developers, investors, providers, they're all key constituents. They're the people they're meeting and discussing with, as I've talked about in the first video. So I could rattle off for hours about the policies that the Victorian government could implement tomorrow, but I think it's crucial to emphasize that there's a reason why they're not doing it. And I think all the examples we went through today show that while reliance on the state can be beneficial in the short term, it's not sufficient to sustain a long-term political project.